Hello, everybody. Today I'm going to be discussing Charles Bukowski's poem Dinosauria We and how it really frames the concept of sense of place, how sense of place is changing within the time of the Anthropocene and in our modern world. Now, if you don't know of Charles Bukowski, he was a German American, both poet and novelist. He wrote both. I have linked the original manuscript that I'm referencing for this particular poem in the description of the voice thread, so I do recommend going and really checking that out. So that way you can get a full idea of the entirety of the poem, because while I may not be going into depth about every single part of it, it is a very powerful poem in what it states. It actually goes over many different topics, which is fascinating, and it's very fun to break it down. However, for the purposes of this presentation, I will be looking at sense of place. A little more background into Bukowski and this poem in particular. This was written in 1991. This falls in line with a lot of Bukowski's tone within both his poetry and his novels. If you haven't read Bukowski, that's absolutely fine. Normally, Bukowski's work is very dark, very pessimistic, normally with a hopeful ending type of twist. Not always, but in the case of this poem in particular, there is a more hopeful ending, even if it's not the ending that we quite expect. Bukowski typically does this because he is writing from the perspective of those in lower and middle classes. His fame did not really arise until towards the end of his life and after his death. So he did not grow up in this rich, very easygoing lifestyle. He lived on the streets, he lived in very rundown apartments and houses most of his life. He jumped from job to job. He dealt with things that the average person in the lower and middle classes would deal with. So from that, we actually get a better idea of how the environment has been affected for those in the lower and middle class, and how the sense of place for those in those classes and in that lifestyle are actively affected, or how they may not seemingly be affected. They may not actively know it. This poem falls in line with a lot of his work. It is primarily about the state of the world and the future of the state of the world, and the ending has a very, very big focus on the environment, future of the environment, and then eventually nature and the environment reclaiming the world after humans are off of it. Again, the audience is really anybody that will listen. Bukowski did not write for anybody in particular. He did have a lot of political themes in his work. He was very open about his own thoughts and his own ideas. So anybody that would listen, but it's from the perspective of the lower and middle class, so more than likely it would be for those just like him, so that way they could get an idea of what's going on around them and what's affecting them. Now, our understanding of place and our sense of place. Quote, our understanding of the environment is first and foremost informed by our experience of place, the geographic location where we live, work, and interact with nature and people. Our identity, culture, history, and politics are bound up in a sense of place. End quote. Sense of place within this poem is the strongest thing. It's what I am arguing is the strongest and how Bukowski approaches it. Because just in the first stanza, in lines 1 through 9, the idea of what is normal has changed. Our sense of place is not entirely the same. It may have at one point been that our sense of place is more directly incorporated with the actual land, with the history of the place, with, the actual physical nature, the trees and the grass and things. However, Bukowski's poem more or less argues that our sense of place is what we are born into, so it may not be what we actually think. And in fact, it has changed a lot as our places have changed. When you are born into something, when you are born like this, into this, as the oily fish spit out their oily prey and as the sun is masked, being born into that, that's really all you know. You don't know any different. So your sense of place already is starting out as something darker, something much more dangerous. Now, this new normal, per se, this new normal of oily fish and oily prey and the sun being masked seems just fine, but it's due to the Anthropocene, due to the, quote, human-driven chemical, physical, and biological changes to the Earth's atmosphere, land surface, and oceans, end quote. And we see that just in these first few lines, and we continue to see it throughout the poem. Our sense of place has rapidly changed due to the Anthropocene and all of the human changes. We now are much more used to the fact that there are oil spills, there are pollutions in the air that mask our sense of nature and what actually may be coming through. There are a lot more dangers in the world due to the fact that we have damaged the environment in what we do. But for many, this just seems normal and we don't actively realize it just because it's what we've grown up in. Now, in lines 10 through 16, we continue to see more of this being born into something. We are born like this. Automatically, Bukowski is stating that our sense of place and how we interact with place is impacted by what we are born into. We are automatically born into being this way because that's just how we grow up, and a lot of times we don't have that outside exposure into doing any sort of change. Place has become somewhere that's associated with more or less a loss of power if you are on the lower end where you're not taking over land, an emptiness from anything, and something that's more broken. But it still seems normal to many people that are living in these rundown areas. The sense of place in the time of the Anthropocene is much more akin to broken factory windows of emptiness, as Charles Bukowski would say, because there are so many factories around us now. We now have more cities, more pollutants within the air, and even though our environment is, quote, linked to culture through relations of power, agency, and responsibility to human and non-human environments, end quote, we are struggling with the fact that there is a binary between environment, nature, and humans, which the binaries really doesn't exist. We are all one and the same. Bukowski does go on to argue this within the poem. He really reiterates this point that what we put in comes back out to us. And here we see a prime example of this. As we go further along into the poem, we get Bukowski's future sense of place. This could very well be something that happens to us without this environmental justice that we are pushing for. Land will be useless. Food will become a diminishing return. Nuclear power will be taken over by the many. There will be radiation. We'll push further than what the earth and the environment can give us because of this damage, because of nuclear power at any scale, explosions which could be anything from war explosions and government testing things. It could also be explosions to mine for resources. We'll push beyond what the Earth can give us and eventually move into more space-like things. This may not be in our immediate future, but to Bukowski, it's something that's very real. In his position, in his time, this is very, very real to him. This is something that could potentially happen. And it's something that should scare us, is essentially what is being driven out of this poem. We should be scared of it, and that is really determined by the word choice and how Bukowski has set up this poem. Continuing on, we see this in the sun will not be seen and it will always be night. Trees will die. All vegetation will die. The sea will be poisoned. The lakes and rivers will vanish. Rain will be the new gold. There will be more hideous diseases. As we're seeing here, disease does majorly impact the world, such as the COVID pandemic. However, Bukowski has taken this. Obviously, he did not know about the COVID pandemic, but in his own time, there were things that he was witnessing and different diseases, and he envisioned that we would continue to have that and they would only get worse because of what is happening to the environment. What we put into the environment comes back out to us. So if we put in nuclear damages and radiation damages, that will inevitably come back to us because we are part of the environment. We are living within the environment. Our sense of place is directly tied to our environment. So though many people may not see it that way, that is the case. Sometimes it takes being put into different words, being put into a poem with a very raw message, with very negative connotations, to be able to see that. Which brings us to word choice. This poem is impactful to many because of its word choice. In lines 22 through 36, we really see this with Bukowski's words that he uses. Dying, muted, castrated, debauched, disinherited, fooled, used, made inhuman, because of what's coming back to us that we have put in. Essentially, we are doing to ourselves what we've done to the environment, because we are in a cycle with the environment that we have to protect it if we want to protect ourselves. Words and phrases indicate this damage that has been created by humans. A lot of that is what Bukowski has really focused on within this poem. However, then we start to see the hope towards the end. After everything has decayed, after everything has gone, we see the hope of the environment and nature reclaiming the world after all of this damage is done. In lines 69 through 75, there will be the most beautiful silence never heard born out of that. The sun's still hidden there awaiting the next chapter. The most beautiful silence never heard because it will never be heard by humans. By this point, this decay, this noise pollution as well, every kind of pollutant, everything that we have put the damage into the environment, the sense of place suddenly changes, but we won't be around to experience it. The sun will still be there. The sun may be hidden, but the sun is waiting. The environment comes back to reclaim what was taken from it after the damages are done. Now, I find this ending particularly strong because of the fact that it's a beautiful silence never heard. Only the environment will be able to hear it, but yet something will still be born from these damages. It just has to reach a very extreme point. So what do we end up taking from this? With more time, I would love to dive into this more, but we see that a sense of place has changed and it is actively changing. This is due primarily because of the Anthropocene that we are actively in and seeing those changes and issues. We also see that the binary of nature and human, or of environment and human, does not actively exist. The damage done comes back to us. We take the damage because we are part of the environment. There is not a binary despite what man has actively created. We are part of the environment, and the environment will not stop with us. After we have done damages to it, the environment will continue to go on, but we will deal with those consequences of what we have done. However, we can help the environment thrive, and we can help the environment grow to be better. And in turn, we are helping ourselves, and we can regain a sense of place that is calmer and that is better for us and for the non-human entities within our environment. Thank you for taking the time to listen, and I hope that you do check out this poem in full and sort of gain an idea of the poem itself. Thank you so much.